Hello, and welcome to the Media Copilot. It's a podcast and newsletter all about how generative AI is changing the media, journalism, and the news. I'm Pete Paschal, longtime tech journalist and founder of the Media Copilot, and on this podcast, I'm excited to bring you fascinating conversations with fellow journalists, media executives, and the people helping to build the AI-driven newsrooms of the future. I'm excited today to welcome to the Media Copilot podcast Charlie Beckett. Charlie is a professor in the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics, and he's the founding editor of Polis, the school's international journalism think tank. He's currently leading Polis's Journalism and AI project, which is just days away from the JournalismAI Festival, which starts on December 6th. I'm excited to talk to Charlie today about AI and journalism and what he's looking forward to at the festival. So, Charlie, welcome to the Media Copilot.
Thanks very much. Great to be here.
Awesome. So tell me a little bit about your journey with AI and journalism. I think, most of us, the connection started probably exactly a year ago when ChatGPT debuted to a big splash. But when did you first start thinking about AI journalism and how this is going to sort of change the whole industry?
Well, we started the project 5 years ago when generative AI was still science fiction. And the reason we did it was because, I'm an ex-journalist. I worked in TV news mainly for 25 years, and there were big kind of tech changes then. The internet came along at one point, and then when I came to the LSE, you start getting social media, this second wave of kind of disruption. And I kind of thought AI felt like it could be the third wave, if you like, of technological disruption. And so we started the work. We set up this Journalism AI project. Is very, very global. We work with, we work with thousands of journalists around the world from more than 100 countries. And we started off just asking them what they were doing. And it was really clear that even with sort of old-fashioned AI, that this was starting to have a very significant impact on all aspects of journalism.
And when you say old-fashioned AI, you're talking about
machine learning, natural language processing, the stuff that you needed to know how to code, or you needed to understand, algorithms and so on to actually build anything. And it was generally very good at performing relatively simple tasks, but at great scale and great speed. So a company like Bloomberg, for example, were already automating a huge part of their output because it was often very simple financial, factual stories. And it was fascinating, the way that it could do clever things like help with big investigations when you had a huge data leak, but also very routine things like, automating A/B testing headlines, for example. And on the revenue side, people were using AI to try and do propensity modeling, trying to find out what it would take to get somebody to subscribe to them. And so that was already happening at some scale, and it was increasing. But then obviously, as you said, when ChatGPT was launched last year, that was a total game changer. I'm sure we're going to talk about why. But the main reason was it was a brilliant bit of marketing. This idea you just put a prompt in was such a great design. And it meant that where AI before was a bit of the kind of techie thing, now anyone could play with it. And that's transformed our project and our work.
Well, yeah, for sure. And I feel like that was definitely sort of a phase shift in how AI gets applied to journalism and anything with content creation. There's sort of pre-ChatGPT and post. And like you said earlier, it was kind of about algorithms finding the right audience and pairing it with the right content and sort of ensuring that is quicker, smoother, and even to some extent automating the content generation. And previously it was sort of more like templated stories, machine generated stuff. But now with these large language models, they're writing sort of quote unquote original, entire articles that, we've sort of seen both the promise and the perils of that in the last several months. Right.
Yeah.
Getting back to that, I think most journalists and most organizations, particularly small to medium newsrooms, have only in the last year really started thinking about this stuff. And what do you think are the, I guess, first principles as a sort of newsroom wanting to leverage this? How do you approach this interesting, novel, and potentially transformative technology?
Yeah.
What are the first things that you should start thinking about and how to frame it even?
Well, I'm going to base my answer basically on we did a lot of research this year. We spoke to more than 100 newsrooms around the world for a big survey. We published a report in September, which looked at what newsrooms were doing with generative AI and old AI, but also what they thought about it and what they were planning to do with it. And we were trying to answer your question as well, which is how are they approaching it? Because this is different. It's a different technology. So, and it works in novel ways. So perhaps you ought to think in a different, to strategize in a different way. And the basic thing we think is the best practice is, first of all, as you suggested, be careful. Don't rush. We've seen all the horrible mistakes that people have made by rushing to use this and using it inappropriately, unleashing it on writing quite complicated stories that turn out not to be true. And that's not very good for journalism, generally speaking. So the best practice we've seen is people who have experimented with it and they've assigned responsibility to somebody to be in charge, if you like, of a generative AI, to think about it. And to start conversations within your workplace, because you can guarantee that somebody somewhere will be using Gen AI in some form, perhaps just for transcription or translation. And you want to know about that, partly because you want to avoid them screwing up, but also perhaps they're doing something really clever. I spoke to a chap doing coding in a newsroom, and he said it was making him 80% more effective, more efficient. Now, if I'm the editor, I want to know that, because I want to make sure that everyone else is going to benefit in a safe way. The other thing that's been really useful I've seen is where newsrooms have drawn up guidelines. And the guidelines may be saying, do this or don't do that. But generally, they might just be saying, look, think about this. Make sure that you don't, if you're not going to use this stuff, that you tell your editor, for example, and be aware that these are the certain risks and these are the certain benefits and so on. But mainly, make sure that it stays coherent with our mission, our editorial values, and also our business values as well. So it's that kind of approach. And then start to think about perhaps something more substantial. And that is literally happening as we speak. The better newsrooms are now starting to think of actual products. It could be a chatbot, for example, or new services that you might produce, or internal processes that you might try and expand and standardize that use Gen AI. So it's going to be a fascinating next 12 months, because I think we're going to get down to sort of brass tacks. People are going to start saying, well, does this really work? Is this really reliable? Everyone's really excited or frightened, but can it work?
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on a lot of things there. And I want to talk a little bit more about the festival and some of the programming and you're going to do in a minute. But since you talked about sort of some of the perils of going down the path of actual content generation, I wanted to ask you about something that happened recently, which was it was all over the news, and it was all about certainly media news, where Sports Illustrated, sort of a venerable brand, had basically, they say they weren't necessarily AI written articles, but certainly the profiles of the people were. Anyway, it was sort of evergreen content. I'll link it in the show notes. Everyone, I think, sort of knows what I'm talking about. But I guess without going too down the path of the state of the media business today, I'm more interested in how when you start to think about using AI to generate content, and sort of having humans in the loop, and basically, like, what do you think are the main lessons from that incident, and which is the latest in a series of incidents of various publications trying to sort of do this thing in terms of getting AI to actually write either parts of things or entire things. Are there, without just the basic lesson of don't do that, like what are the more sort of nuanced takeaways from that?
Well, I think it's really interesting. I mean, firstly, most of the mistakes that have been made, over this last year with Gen AI. Things like the fake Michael Schumacher interview. Do you remember that? A magazine that had used AI to make up an interview. Now, the problem with that was a human decision. The AI didn't make them do it. The AI didn't make a mistake. It generated perfectly nice copy. It's just that the humans had lied. And that's not a good thing. Generally speaking, you shouldn't, as a journalist, lie to your audience. And more broadly, I mean, that's obvious, but more broadly, it does raise the question of, how transparent do you have to be? Now, I would suggest if you pretend that it's been written by a human being, and you even make up a byline photo and things, that's not good practice. But if they'd said, hey, we've got some lovely, as you put it, evergreen content here, we've generated it using a program, could be Gen AI, for example, and it's great stuff. An editor has checked it to make sure it's accurate. Well, people might happily accept that. There's no problem with the fact it's been made by a machine as long as it's good journalism. So I think that's the sort of judgment that people have to make. How transparent are you right now? Do you tell people, well, actually, this was written by a freelancer, not by staff, or 60% of this article is actually from agency copy, or the photo was from photo stock, it wasn't, a real photo. Do you always say that? Well, if you do, continue to do it. Be transparent, especially I think right now, because there's so many weird scare stories flying around, and people are so worried about disinformation generally that I think it's probably worth going a little bit further than you would normally to explain what you're doing. You don't have to take it to ridiculous lengths. I mean, if you use Google search, you don't tell the reader, but that's a form of AI, isn't it? So, obviously there's a kind of common sense procedure here as well.
Yeah, and I think kind of also what you're sort of getting at is beyond just the disclosure on individual pieces of content, which, pragmatically might not always be possible. Like certainly not every tweet you're going to say this was generated by AI, but having some kind of public-facing policy that I feel like I don't necessarily think it would have prevented incidents like the Sports Illustrated issue, but I do think it gives everyone something to point at as like, oh, like if you weren't sure this was, over the line or in violation of something, like here it is, right? Yeah. So it gives you something to fall back on.
Yeah, it's good. It's good for the journalists. It's also good for the readers to know that, even if they're not going to read the guidelines, it's nice for them to know that you care about this. And it's also quite a good process. It's good to have that conversation in the newsroom. Somebody who's in charge of AI, if you like, saying, what are you worried about? How can we mitigate the risks? What are the positive things that we expect from using AI? So I think it's quite a kind of hygiene process, if you like, for any newsroom to do.
So I'd love to chat a little bit about the festival and the lineup you have and the topics. Like I was just looking over the program right before we got together here, and it's really great that you have so much international representation here. There's folks from Brazil, Germany, India. I mean, it just sort of is a good reminder of like, I feel like a lot of the generative AI question plus media tends to be very US centric. I don't know, that might be the bubble I just live in, but it is kind of like the technologies are developed here, certainly over the last few weeks with all the OpenAI drama, which isn't directly related, but is obviously, on everyone's minds, given how much influence they have in the whole space. But like just having an international perspective on this is really, really key. Also because one of the big promises of the tools, I mean, certainly with the audio and video, I've seen nonstop, breaking news about translation and just making content more available to different audiences, which I think is great. But at the same time, having sort of run a content strategy at a couple of different places, that makes my head hurt on terms of distribution and, connecting. It's all well and good to have content that is good, catering to a certain audience, but if you are not set up to distribute and cultivate that audience, I'm not sure sort of how much help it does. So, but at least anyway, tell me a little bit about sort of the international perspective on this.
Well, as you say, it's really global, and this is one of the joys of this project over the last 5 years. It's become more and more and more global. And if you think about Gen AI, as you said, it's very much an American-based technology. I mean, there's a big London presence as well, of course, but it's very much English language orientated as well. And that makes it really interesting when you're working internationally, because, of course, the technology is applicable universally. The journalistic challenges are very common throughout the world as well. And as you mentioned, it offers both hope that you can cross the language barrier, but also it does have this bias towards English. So we've been working really hard. I mean, for example, with our products, the recent report is in Spanish and it's in English, and we're going to publish it in Arabic as well. But the teams themselves, so that's what's fascinating, is when you've got, for example, we've got a team from Deutsche Welle in Germany working with a team from Jordan. We've got a team which is comprised of Malaysian, Germans, and Indians as well. And so they're kind of having to cross the language barrier. And obviously, it's all remote. And that's been really helpful. The one thing that people have taken away from this experience has been collaboration, that you can get inspiration and insight by working with people who aren't like you, who perhaps are from a different country or a different kind of news organization. So we've got people from very big groups like, India Today, also people from much smaller niche fact-checking organizations, for example. And there's a kind of chemistry that happens when these people are approaching common problems together. And some of these challenges they're doing are rather complicated. So one team, where are they from? They're from Reuters, for example, and they're looking at decoding complex timelines with temporal knowledge graphs. Now, that's way out of my league technologically, but others are more kind of focused on things that any journalist would understand. So, for example, looking at elections, how can you use Gen AI to fact check statements being made during an election, for example? So that's a really practical one. And then there's another one which is really fascinating, where they're going to try and use AI detect bias in content. They're looking at both English and Arabic content. It's a kind of, it's not about fake news. It's trying to see where people are coming from politically, especially. So you get a sense of, for example, if there's fair representation, which I don't know, during an election would be really important, but more is interesting. Full stop. So these guys are all going to be presenting. We'll have other panels as well. So they're going to be presenting their work, doing little presentations. So I'm really eager to find out. I've been working with them through the year, but they're very autonomous, and they've been working with experts from all sorts of different news organizations and from tech companies and from other universities who have been helping them. So it's a bit like an early Christmas present for me. I get to unwrap the things they've been doing all year.
Yeah, the bias topic, one I'm fascinated in, certainly as someone who's sort of observed media over the last 20 years and has watched it just sort of contort a little bit in the wake of both blogging and social media. And now it's no secret that the media seems like it's gotten really polarized, and you have these publications, either officially or unofficially, have some kind of sort of political bias. And some lean into that, and some sort of don't do or purport to be more objective, but maybe aren't really. I wonder if there is enough sort of, I don't know, soul searching in the media today to sort of think like, well, why don't we use like something that is ostensibly, I wouldn't say objective, but like if you could sort of figure out where your bias is, and if it is your mission to kind of be more balanced, maybe that could sort of to wake up an organization to like, oh, we need to sort of, create things with a slightly different perspective, maybe going forward.
That's exactly the point of it. I mean, I'm from a BBC tradition, but even the BBC has a certain bias. It has a bias towards objectivity. So bias itself isn't the problem. I think bias can be a good thing. Say, for example, you're, biased in favor of a clean environment. That's not a bad bias to have necessarily.
Right.
But the important thing is knowing the bias. and understanding it. I think that's interesting. And even at the BBC, they did an inquiry a few years ago where they realised that they had been very unbalanced around certain issues, like, for example, Europe. They were unaware of their own biases. So it's going to be a really interesting program. And it's obviously incredibly difficult to do. I mean, how do you measure it?
Yeah, I know. Really that sort of brings up like the tools themselves and the biases those tools might have, right? So I think it's going to be a difficult thing to get 100% right. But if it's directional, if it's guidelines, I like that. Because again, we could go on all day on this topic, but just as a final note, it's like I see a lot of people think the bias is top down, that it's like, oh, we want to be biased and this is our organizational point of view. And I find it's usually the opposite. It's usually you hire reporters who, just have everyone has their points of view and it informs their reporting. And over time, that sort of will influence your organization. And that, is a thing that as someone who is a decision maker at that organization, you want to get ahead of. So I feel like it's a helpful tool for that. Okay, so moving on, I know you've done a lot of work in your past about sort of misinformation, and certainly AI and the tools it brings doesn't just empower journalists, empowers what you might call bad actors out there, and whether they're just goofing around with deep fakes or they're actually trying to create some kind of disinformation campaign. How should journalists and newsrooms think about that? And I kind of feel like given the ubiquity of these tools now, how could this be anything but a losing battle going forward versus folks just determined to get bad information out there?
Yeah. Well, I think, it's clear. We know already that the people, the bad actors are already using AI and generative AI today. And that's because they don't care about inaccuracies or other risks and so on, because they're creating bad content. And so they're already out there and they're doing it, and they're not going to stop, and it is going to be a problem. I'm not going to play that down at all. And there are going to be some journalists, there's some fantastic, fact-checking, OSINT type journalism outfits who are going to be using Gen AI and other tools to track this down, to understand it, and most importantly, to see where the source is. Because the source is not the AI. The source is a human being who decides that they're going to publish, malicious or misleading content. It's real people, it's politicians, it's activists, and it's people who are doing it for profit, of course. They're trying to attract the advertising. So there are going to be some journalists who have special skills, but I think, first of all, we can exaggerate the impact of some of this disinfo. I think the worst thing about it is probably that it means that people can't trust anything. They find it difficult, they're confused and difficult to believe. But I think the best response is to build journalism better. It's to use Gen AI, in an ethical, responsible way, and provide, if you like, a kind of safe haven. That if your journalism is trustworthy and accurate and reliable, and you're doing your best, and to be credible and to verify and so on, and you can use these tools to help you to do that, then you're doing all you can do, which is provide that alternative, to provide that safe space. We're never going to be able to. People who talk about solving so-called fake news are dreaming. It's always been out there in some form. It's just much more visible, and it perhaps moves much faster than it used to because of modern technology. But as I say, I think that the real job of the journalist is not to go around debunking everything, not to go around policing social media. That's other people's job, frankly. Our main job is to make sure that our journalism is as good as it could be and as accessible for people as well.
Nice. Yeah. Sort of related, very related. I want to zero in on the topic of generative imagery. And we've seen a certain amount of, I guess, misinformation with regard to, the recent conflict in Gaza versus Israel and Hamas. And there was a lot of, certainly in the early days, a lot of back and forth over images and whether they're accurate or not. And then there was sort of that secondary issue of, well, there were generative images that were supposed to be illustrative of conflict, but didn't really happen. And then those sort of leaked out in a few places. So I'm kind of trying to sort of back into a question of like, what are the ethics of generative imagery? But I know it's a very, I almost said multimodal, but like multifaceted response to that question, because there's different use cases. Like, there's obviously photojournalism, which obviously you wouldn't do it, right? But then you all certainly have what I wouldn't even quite call it lifestyle journalism, but there's a lot of sort of applications of generative imagery with regard to things that aren't necessarily breaking news, spot news, or directly about a real world event, right? Where it seems appropriate. So I guess, like, as an organization that's trying to figure out the ethics of these things, putting yourselves in the minds of these leaders, like, how do you sort of guide your staff and guide the industry in a way? If you're like the BBC or the Times or whatever, like, how do you both empower your staff but also guard against sort of not just bad information getting out there, but also kind of like a cheapening of the whole industry, which I can sort of explain a little bit. I think you know what I mean, right? The more you use generative imagery, the less you're actually relying on real illustrators and photojournalists. So it's a whole very thorny issue, I feel like.
Yeah, I mean, we just published about a month ago. We published a short report on this, actually. Photojournalism in the age of AI, and the author of that made the good point, which is, in a way, these dilemmas are not new. That photography has always been to a degree, about manipulation. You frame a picture in a certain way. You might adjust the lighting. When you get back into the dark room, you might, use different filters, whatever. You might crop it and so on. So there's always been that element of it. And
it used to be hard, though.
Yeah, and it's been quite easy recently, because obviously with digital photography, which has been around for 15 years or so, that immediately means that you can use Adobe Photoshop or whatever. So now, of course, with Gen AI, it is much easier. And it's got frighteningly better, hasn't it, in the last 12 months? It's gone from kids painting type quality to, masterworks in a few months. But I think basically, if you apply the standards that you used before, then you should be okay. Now, it's really important, obviously, for news photography to be real. What's the point otherwise? There's really no point making up an image of Gaza or Ukraine or something. That is a betrayal of trust. And you would never do that before. So I do it now. And if you use a generated image, for example, as you said, as like a stock photo, if it was a stock photo, you'd say, perhaps Getty or Shutterstock or something, you'd say. And so I think it's that kind of labeling just continues, and there's no harm. I mean, I've spoken to people in newspapers and TV as well, actually, who are starting to use it for graphics, for example. Say, for example, you need an image that represents a story. It could be climate change, and you want a picture of the sun and a dry field or something. Well, you could use a stock photo, or you might make up an obviously stylized image using Gen AI. And there's nothing wrong with that, because it's quite clear that you're not pretending that it's a real photo. That's when the problem starts, if you pretend that it's a real image or photo. So I think, funnily enough, for journalism, it's I think the sort of boundary lines have always been there, and I think it's just a question of applying it. With the fake news bit, obviously what's interesting was you mentioned the Gaza conflict, and most of the imagery that's been misleading in that has been real images, but in the wrong context. Right. It's people saying, oh, look, this is the Israelis massacring children. It turns out it's Russian soldiers in Syria or something from 20 years ago. Or even, my favorite is screenshots of video games being used because they're so realistic looking. This is what's happening in Gaza now. So it's actually humans, again, it's humans deliberately misrepresenting what is actually real imagery, but in the wrong context. And there's been less of the generative stuff. And I think there's something interesting going on there, which is you can sort of fool people with fake imagery, but kind of why would you bother?
You kind of don't need it in a
You
sense,
don't really
given what
need
you're
it.
saying. If you're determined to lie, there's anything you could use, and there are certainly an audience that will believe you.
Yeah.
But I also feel like if there's a hopeful sort of place I'm going to here, it's that this has increased the skepticism of people of stuff that's just flying around on Twitter. But I think, again, something you said earlier was was a good point here, in that you can easily go to the extreme on that point and just not believe anything. But to your point earlier about like, if your journalism is solid, if you have the right processes and you have that trust that you've built, it just becomes more valuable than ever in this environment.
Yeah, exactly. I think so. And I think we saw that during the pandemic, where there was a big uptick in attention for, those big, orthodox, well-established news organizations.
Right.
Because it was a life and death thing. People really did want to know. I know there was a lot of conspiracy nonsense out there as well, a lot of anti-vax nonsense and so on. But that was mainly on social media. And we can still cling to the evidence which suggests that people do say that they believe journalism more than they believe social media.
Mm-hmm. At least, yeah, depending on how you define each. But yes, and I think social media is kind of, I don't know, it's sort of definitely entering a different phase with what's happened to Twitter and stuff. But that's a whole different thing.
That's putting it very euphemistically as well.
So right before we wrap up, I want to zoom in and then I want to zoom out. So zooming in, which is to say, like, at the individual sort of journalist level, what do you think are the best ways reporters and the people that help them gather the news and create the news can start to use Gen AI in the most, I guess, the ways that they can increase the most efficiency, but also, like, with that trust in mind?
Yeah.
So what do you?
Well, if I can steal your program title, I think see it as a co-pilot. It's there like a very helpful intern. I think it's an office tool, if you like. So if I'm a really busy journalist, and if it can help me organize, I don't know, my press releases, the email newsletters I get, if it can help me to reformat content. Say, for example, I write something and then the editor says we want a really short version of it. Well, you can use generative AI to do that kind of task. You can ask it to suggest a range of headlines, for example, a kind of brainstorming tool. So there's lots of ways that it can supplement your work, just as an individual journalist. And I would say, jump right in, not obviously to publish, because as we keep saying, it's not a truth machine, it's a language machine. So don't ask it for facts. Don't ask it for the truth. It does not know. But it can be very helpful in arranging information and so on. And I would say jump in and start prompting. You just get on there and start playing with it. And don't just do it for 5 minutes and get disappointed. Because there will be disappointments. You'll find inaccuracies, but you'll also find it does some things really cleverly. Give you a little example. I was on holiday. I was going on holiday to Taiwan for 6 days. My lovely partner, she spent a week researching the trip and came up with an itinerary. I asked ChatGPT, and within 2 seconds, it came up with a very similar itinerary, a really good plan for that holiday. So that's a pretty harmless and risk-free use case. But so go in and play with it repeatedly in different ways, but also just make sure you're informed. Just do some basic AI literacy. There's loads of content on my website, for example. It's all free and very accessible. We've got something called an AI starter pack, for example, where you can just click through yourself interactively, and you can do 10 minutes doing it, or you can spend 5 hours doing research on it, just to get a sense of the different use cases and what other people have been doing. And indeed, some of the limitations and risks. Because I do think it's inevitable. It's going to be part of our lives. Just like, we all got used to using smartphones. We all got used to this idea of Google search. It's almost second nature now. An old journalist like me still thinks it's a bit miraculous that you can do all this stuff. But I think we're going to be thinking the same about Gen AI, that it's being built into so many things, isn't it? Like Microsoft and so on.
Yeah.
It's being built into so many other systems. I think it's only just around the corner when your newsroom CMS will, of course, have Gen AI facilities built into it.
Yeah, well, that's definitely where we're going, and it segues really nicely into the zoom out question I wanted to ask you, which is to say, well, once AI is sort of built into the world and it's sort of the air we breathe, and we're starting to see that now with like generative search, right?
Yeah.
And Google and Bing and whatever Microsoft's calling it today are starting to just more and more just give you the answer. And I know they've been sort of doing these zero-click searches for a while, but now the generative AI, it might actually be good. It might actually give you the right answer, which of course begs the question of like, well, what about that traffic that publishers depend on? Where is it getting that information? How about training? And so in a few years, we're going to have this AI mediated world where media and journalism certainly has a role. But the sort of things are going to look different. So how are they going to look? And that's kind of my question. Like, what does media and journalism look like in like 3 to 5 years?
I was having a really interesting conversation about this morning with somebody who does Gen AI tools. And we were saying it was very useful to look backwards sometimes and see, what did we really expect there to be this boom of podcasts? Did we expect that? That's a very weird development. And it was partly enabled by new technology. It was enabled by the AirPods you have. Suddenly people could listen to podcasts wherever they were without any wires hanging around. So I think there's going to be some unexpected consequences of this by its very nature. But I do think that there's the biggest risk is that Gen AI is going to be really good. That sounds odd. But if Gen AI, as you said, starts to become much more accurate, much more accessible, then you're quite right. Why would I go to a news website or app if I can go to ChatGPT and get things explained to me at least? It will never be quite as good at breaking news and stuff like that. But, why would I go to a journalist? And we've been asking that question for the last 20 years. If I can go to the internet, why do I need a journalist? If I can go online to Instagram or something and find stuff out there, why do I need a journalist? But now this one is a much bigger one because, as you said, it doesn't even give a link necessarily. It doesn't have to give a link. It can just give the person the answer. So I think we're going to see newsrooms doing, in a way, what they have been doing over the last 10, 15 years, which is stressing, in a way, the human element, thinking very much about what the audience needs are. How do they want the journalism? What kind of topics do they want us to cover? How do they want us to cover those stories? And being much more aware of adding value. So it's not just about collecting data. It's about brilliant data journalism design, for example. It's about something very physical, getting out of the office and going reporting, going to law courts, going to council meetings, going to meet real people in their real lives. That the AI can't do any of those things. The AI has no judgment, no empathy, no real intelligence. So, for example, you being an expert specialist is going to be really important in the future. So I think there's this sort of paradox, which I'm optimistic that journalists will make the best use of Gen AI tools, and I hope that might give them more resource to spend on the human side of it. And that's going to be so important. Brands paying real attention to their subscribers or members or whatever they are is going to be super important. We really have to get into our heads as journalists that the news industry is not there for us. It's a service industry. It's not about creating product, although of course you have to do that. It's a service. Right. It's informing people, entertaining people, educating people, keeping people on trend, giving them useful material or just material that makes them go, wow, that's exciting and interesting. So I think that all-out focus is going to be on that. So it's a dual, isn't it? Get across the Gen AI tools because they're going to help you. And if you don't, your audience will disappear.
It's good advice. Charlie, this has been great. How can people find out more about the festival, and is there an online component? How should people?
Yeah, it's all going to be online because we're so global. You could never pull all those people together in one place. So it's all going to be online. You have to register, but it's all free and accessible, and we will be putting it online if you can't make it live. Just search Journalism AI LSE, and you'll come across our wonderful website with huge resources, including things like a lovely newsletter that you should all sign up for, and of course details of how to register for the festival next week.
Outstanding. All right. Journalism AI begins December 6th. Charlie, this has been great. Thanks so much for the conversation. You have been listening to the Media Copilot. Please subscribe at mediacopilot.substack.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at @TheMediaCopilot. And we'll be seeing you in the future.